We have a very illustrious panel today. I'll give you an opportunity, gentlemen, in just a few minutes to introduce yourselves. But we have Meetjaz Lewis, Mark Conway, and Paul N.D. Thornell. And these gentlemen are actually alumni of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. And I'm actually a lecturer at the University of Maryland in the School of Public Policy. And thank you all for having this timely and very important conversation. So I definitely want to alert everyone that this panel and webinar is actually now being recorded, so you can see in the comments a prompt there. And what we'll do first is take the first 5 to 10 minutes to allow these gentlemen to introduce themselves and address the first prompt. But then after that, we'll take the next 30 to 45 minutes to address a few loaded questions as it pertains to Black men in public policy. And then we'll open up the remainder of the panel or the webinar for discussions or questions from you all, the audience. So thank you again, gentlemen, for joining us today. And so Meetjaz, I'll definitely start with you, sir. So just understanding the plights of Black men in America, period. But now being in public policy as a Black man, while Black men are still underrepresented and underutilized in public policy, but there is an emerging and exclusive group of us that are trying to answer the call to both supporting and leading society towards a greater good. Even though Black men are still marginalized and underrepresented, what do you think the apathy and the self-destruction and the hostility, where is that narrative coming from? But before you get into that question, can you at least give me the origin story of why public policy for you?
Thank you, Rico. Once again, my name is Meetjaz Lewis. I'm a graduate of the School of Public Policy. A little quick piece on my origin story. I went to University of Maryland undergrad as well, and I worked my way through school playing guitar at local churches and other odd jobs. I used to work at the Quality Inn Hotel, which has now since been demolished, and they have some new student housing that's building up there. But I got into politics originally for selfish reasons. When I was in undergrad, and I'm sure Mark may message on this a little bit too, the recession was going on and the legislature was discussing raising tuition, and the university in particular was also talking about laying off diverse faculty, particularly non-tenured faculty who tend to be women, folks of color, immigrants, things of that nature. And those are the folks who made this university home for me, right? So both the issue of tuition, being to literally afford going to school because I worked my way through, and being to be successful here were threatened. So me and a number of other students organized, and about 600 students came to a town hall. The next day, about 1,000 students marched on the main administration building to see what could be done to address the tuition hikes and ultimately make sure that we didn't lose the diverse faculty. And it's actually, very relevant because Mark and I were in that room where we were pushed to essentially negotiate what it would take for us to stand down on those measures. And that taught me that people power changes lives. So I became a community organizer after I graduated college, working in Baltimore and later in Philadelphia. And my experience on the streets of Baltimore and Philly and in Prince George's County, where I'm born and raised, taught me that policy has the capacity to change these things we see in the community, right? So I came back to the School of Public Policy. I got my master's. After I graduated, I went to work for Majority Leader Congressman Steny Hoyer, where I work as a senior advisor for him on Capitol Hill. Right now, as you all know, there's a lot going on there. They're not necessarily a bastion for functionality, but because I still want to get things done, I ran myself and got elected to the State House in Annapolis to move the ball forward for many of us. So I'll stop there as far as my introduction, but many of the issues I work on are grounded in my experience here as a student and my experience working on the streets and communities across Maryland. So should I answer your initial question now, or do you want me to wait so everyone else can introduce themselves, Rico?
Well, actually, yeah, we'll do an introductions and then we can get into that question. Thank
Perfect.
you, Jazz. Congratulations on your election on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in after that. Yeah, Jazz and I know each other very, very well. Attending the Maryland together and building a very close relationship during that time. Yeah, I remember that protest, Jazz, is for Dr. Black. He was the associate provost for equity and diversity, and he was being pushed out, and he meant so much to communities of color, to underrepresented communities at the time. And as we saw that happening, we wouldn't take it. We stormed the administration building. We each wrote letters, taped those letters to the front door of the administration building, while you and I were inside talking to the provost about what we needed to do to make sure that Dr. Black could keep his job and continue to serve the students of color, underrepresented students on campus. But yeah, so my story, I'm a kid from the Bronx, grew up in the Bronx and moved to Maryland to go to Maryland. It was a big deal for my parents. We visited a ton of schools, and Maryland was the last school I visited, and it was probably the perfect day. I fell in love with the campus. I fell in love with the school. I loved the experience. I got into policy because of one of my mentors, Dr. Nina Harris. She really took me under her wing and looked out for me and made sure that I made the right decisions in undergrad, and eventually took the step to grad school. I focused on environmental policy in grad school and worked at the EPA for a bit, which was a very interesting experience. I think we'll get into some of the federal conversation about jobs and otherwise. But I left the EPA and moved to Baltimore to work for the mayor's office. Worked in the mayor's office for 5 years, started out as an analyst in the mayor's office at City Stat, and working my way up to deputy director and for a time acting director. I then left that job to run a nonprofit. I'm still feeling an itch for environmental issues called the Baltimore Tree Trust, planting trees in low-income communities and greening up Baltimore City. But then also trying to find a way to make those environmental issues meet some of the community needs by training folks for jobs in tree care and landscaping. The opportunity to run for office came up when my councilman said he was not going to run for the seat, and I was crazy, and I decided I was going to do it. So convinced my wife to not be too upset, and ran for city council and won, and I've been in the seat now 10 months. And so now I serve as the chair of public safety, and I get to bring all that experience, having worked in the mayor's office, to the work that I do on the legislative side. And really get to serve my community in multiple ways. So that's sort of my origin story. And as you may see during the course of our conversation, those experiences have really given me different insights on the opportunities and experiences that we as Black men have in government. So
Thank you, Brother Mark. Paul?
Sorry about that. Great. Well, listen, I'm so excited and thankful to be with you all. I will clarify one point at the beginning. I actually am not a Maryland grad. I grew up in Silver Spring, huge Terps fan, and have fond memories of seeing a bunch of different games, a bunch of different sports on campus, but I cannot cannot actually claim University of Maryland as my alma mater, but certainly familiar with the area. I grew up in the DC area, as I mentioned. As you can see probably from my Zoom wall, a long-suffering sports fan up until the last couple of years. The Nats and Caps have had something to make me feel good about things. But I'd say two of the most important elements of my upbringing that kind of, I think, put me where I am today, both literally in terms of the job, but also the passion I have for trying to make the case for a more inclusion for Black men and women in the policy space. One, I grew up early on learning from my grandmother about ancestors of ours, and in particular my great-great-grandfather, George B. Bashan, who was an amazingly accomplished Black man who lived from 1824 to 1878, and really kind of one of these Renaissance people of the time. He was free. He was the first Black graduate of Oberlin College, grew up in the Pennsylvania area, first Black lawyer in the state of New York and Pennsylvania, and ran in the same circles as Frederick Douglass, Martin Delany. His father was close friends with William Lloyd Garrison, so worked a lot in the abolitionist crusade, in addition to being a leader in one of the first Black professors anywhere. He was a founder of Howard University and really has a range of different accomplishments in the years that he lived. What really kind of got me intrigued about his story was like so many in Black history, it's a name we don't know, the sort of hidden figures syndrome, as we've come to appreciate. But also it's that there are different ways that Black people have had to engage and advocate and navigate the public policy space, because in some ways the traditional paths on the legal side, in some cases, or the political channels, offices, elected office, were not, of course, something that our ancestors could be a part of in the traditional sort of space. And so the different ways that he engaged in advocacy and his peers at the time kind of just prompted me to really take a different look. And for me personally, it meant I wasn't necessarily, I didn't have to go to law school. I don't have to run for office, but there's this sort of broader public policy space that I've found is enjoyable, personally gratifying, and has been a path that I've found myself on. Second sort of, I think, foundational piece for me is that I had the chance to work in the US Senate and then work in the Clinton White House. And one of the things that the sort of those two experiences showed me is that the power of being in the room, having different experiences represented in the room, the figurative room, as it were, but also seeing very up close that in the Senate, there are very few people that look like us in the U.S. Senate in top decision-making roles. And that is a problem, I think, that's more specific to the idiosyncrasies, and Jazz probably knows this well, standing up front of some of the hiring and the ecosystem that is the U.S. Congress, and how people get hired and how people get promoted and how people even just put themselves in consideration for some of these jobs at a staff level that have a tremendous amount of influence. Certainly, we see a number of congressional members of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and other people who bring a real vibrancy and diversity of experience to the table. And there are fewer members, obviously, of color in the Senate, but that is important to have that experience there, and we need more. But behind the curtains, there are staff that are, as we know, really running the show on a lot of this stuff. And when I went from the Senate to the White House, and I saw in that Clinton White House, certainly a lot more faces that looked like mine, told me there was actually something wrong and broken with the Senate hiring process. Not to say that any administration, Clinton administrations, no different, can't have more. So yes, should we have had more? Absolutely. But there is something when we look at an institution like the U.S. Senate today, and on the Democratic side, there are no Black chiefs of staff. There are five Black legislative directors. Only one of them is a Black man. There are no Black communications directors. As of today, there are no Black staff directors over the committees. I look at that, and if this is the world that I work in, my feeling is one of embarrassment, humiliation, but it's also, okay, well, how do we fix this? Because if this is the path that I'm walking on, I want to make sure that for a variety of different reasons, the absence of those voices and experiences and ability to influence communities of public policy making as it relates to priorities for communities of color, not being in the room and hearing the numbers that I just lifted up. I hope anybody would look at it and think, wow, well, what is wrong? But then, okay, well, how do we fix it? So anyway, I'll pause there and excited for the discussion.
Yes, and thank you, Brother Paul. And you brought up a really good point as it pertains to that public policy space, and not everybody has to pursue a law degree in order to get in the field of public policy. And to your point, and now I'm going to kind of reframe the question because you gentlemen definitely done a good job of introducing yourselves and somewhat priming this first question again about the underrepresentation and the underutilization of Black men in public policy. And so definitely, Paul, your ancestor probably should have been in this book right here about capital men during the Reconstruction era.
Well, Hiram Revels actually was a very good friend of his.
Oh.
And when he left the Senate and went down to Alcorn to be president of Alcorn, he brought my great-great-grandfather down to be a professor there. So you're 100% right. They were very close.
Right.
Hiram Revels, of course, being one of the first 2 Black senators from Mississippi in that case. But yeah.
Nice. Wonderful. And so I'll start in the same sequence with Jazz first with this question then, about the underrepresentation. And to all of you all's point, not only are Black men underrepresented in leadership positions in all of these levels of public policy, whether it's local government, federal government, state government, but what I'm seeing as well as a professor at University of Maryland in the School of Public Policy, there's also a low representation of Black men in these classes. And so we have a two-headed problem here where we don't have them in leadership now that can actually create these pipelines and be conduits for these young brothers that probably want to enter this field, but we don't even have them in the classrooms to even get a bachelor's or a master's in public policy. So Jazz, how do you think that we should actually address that issue, the underrepresentation on both ends?
You know, I think it's all about like intentional recruitment and how you attract people. And then once they're there, are you making a real space for them? So I tell a story often that when I was getting my master's of public policy in school, I was like the only Black man in all my classes, right? Now there were other folks of color, but I didn't have, and the other thing is, like, I'm pretty sure Mark and I was there around the same time, but we didn't have any classes at the same time with one another. And the story I often tell is that we had a faculty member who taught economics at school, who whenever we would reference poverty in that economics class, she would look in my direction. And of course, the whole class would in turn look in my direction, which doesn't make it welcoming, right? Now, she and I had a conversation about it. It wasn't intentional or anything like that, and it stopped. But, like, you know, we need to have conversations about things like that. We need to be going to the undergraduate programs and not necessarily the easily accessible high schools to recruit. For those who are listening, who are from, you know, Prince George's County or Montgomery County, or generally there's certain schools people go to, the high performing ones. And Prince George's I'm really well acquainted with because I'm from here and I represent there in the legislature. You know, we would recruit from Roosevelt High School, right? We may recruit from Flowers High School, where I went. Where are we going to Suitland High School, right? Which is right across from Southeast in Maryland, or Fairmont Heights High School, right? Which is right across the DC line as well, where the needs may be higher. I think that is critically important. I also think it's important to make sure that you have faculty that are, you know, teaching courses that are relevant to those people that you want to come to your program, right? So for example, when I was there also, a lot of the legislation I put in Annapolis and what I advised Congressman Hoyer on is on issues of economic opportunity and criminal justice reform, right? I was really interested in that as a student. Our policy program had no classes on it, you know? I'm sure if we had more faculty of color, particularly more Black men, because this is something that disproportionately affects Black men, that you would see more folks flocking to take those classes, right? Like there's a cause and effect. Folks aren't just going to sign up for something unless they see there's something in there that affirms me or what I need to move ahead. And I think that's important. I think to Paul's point, the same applies in Annapolis, the Mark Point in Baltimore City Council, as well as Capitol Hill. So most Black staff work for Black members, right? And one of the challenges we have is that, like, that's a great way for you to get in, but are you able to move on to become, a staff director for a committee, or even, move into the private sector or move into government in other places? It can become limiting. I'm different because I do work for Steny Hoyer. I've had my own experiences within the office with other staffers thinking like, well, Jazz, why don't you work on these issues, right? That typically are limited to what they think are issues that Black people or minorities care about. And I just had to essentially do some jujitsu with the member to make sure I wasn't limited, because all issues affect folks of color like anyone else. It's not limited to issues of welfare, right? Or education or criminal justice. It's also issues of financial and economic opportunity too, and making sure you have a seat at the table. So I think we just often have to push, but we have to be intentional about recruiting and pipelining people if we want to see things change.
If I could jump in there, I think, Jazz, you hit on a bunch of things. I can tell you and this happens frequently. People expect that Black folks, Black men are monolithic and always attack the same issues and will always want to do equity and diversity work. And don't get me wrong, that's very valuable work. It needs to happen, and it's exactly what we're talking about right now. But I can tell you, it can be limiting. And this is partially my experience. I think when I was working at the federal level, people don't see you beyond that. And it can be a challenge to get some of those other real opportunities, because you can be pigeonholed into a policy area just because of the color of your skin. And I can tell you, when I started running a tree nonprofit, I mean, it kind of threw people for a loop. It's like, oh, you're a Black guy who loves trees. Yes, I'm a Black guy who loves trees. Why not? I care about my communities. I know what trees mean to the air quality, to the water quality, to the wealth that these communities can bring in when you have a well-treed community. And like, yes, I care about trees. So I think, sometimes it's getting over that mental hurdle for folks to realize that we as Black men are more than just Black men. We are men, and we think about all the same issues, whether it's wealth building, whether it's environmental, whether it's any of those issues. And so I think sometimes that can be a hurdle. I think another thing that came to mind, definitely targeted recruitment. I think one other way that we often overlook in the job sector is that sort of unspoken network that actually gets people jobs. I mean, I know for students that may be watching, if you're not going through this now, you'll be going through it very soon. Applying for jobs on USA Jobs, you might as well throw your resume out in the wind.
Waste of time.
That's not how you get the jobs. It's the networks, it's the relationships, it's the mentors, it's the people who can speak for you. And when you put that resume in, there's someone else that can say, okay, they've got the qualifications, but this guy is also very, very good for this, that, or the third reason. And the reality, and I think that's how it works for our white counterparts. And I think, unfortunately, what becomes a challenge, I think, for Black folks and Black men in particular, is that the jobs that are available are often pigeonholed into this very particular policy area, equity, diversity. And don't get me wrong, that needs to happen. There need to be those opportunities so that we can have these conversations. And so that those offices who are often overlooking issues for Black communities can be forced to sort of think about these considerations. But the connections, relationships, and otherwise to get those sort of science jobs or science policy jobs or healthcare jobs or whatever you may call it, environmental jobs, we often get overlooked for stuff like that. So that I think the networking web, certainly the mentorship go a long way towards building our young people up so that when those opportunities come up, there are people that can vouch for them. And unfortunately, because there aren't many of us there, there's not many people that can vouch in the Senate or on the House floor or otherwise. So,
and I think one thing I would add is that there's no way to not surface some often uncomfortable and complex realities of behavior and prejudices and implicit bias that we all bring to this. And one thing that I think is important to call out, at least in my observation, that certainly as it relates to, all young people, you need to understand you are going to be evaluated based on what happens from the moment of sort of the beginning of some communication between you and a prospective employer and beyond that. And also, you're going to be evaluated on things about you when you're not in the room. Right. So it starts, let's say you got a colleague of yours, a friend of yours to connect you with someone. Understanding the importance of communication and precision. You have if Jazz connects me with Mark for a job interview, puts us on an email, and Mark's kind enough to respond, you can't wait 3 days. I can't wait 3 days to then respond to that email. Like, you gotta move. People, this is, and people don't want to hear about stuff that you might have going on in your life. Okay. You got to be on it, and you got to show that, and here's one of the complex words I'm about to share. You have to show that you are a safe candidate for a job. And that's a really loaded word and really uncomfortable, but one of the things I think Black men in particular have to overcome is being viewed as being safe. And what I mean by that is it's not inconsistent with being good. Safe does not mean bad. Safe doesn't mean, but it's understanding that from how you communicate to people that can validate your merits, to knowing how to navigate the system. Certainly working in the Senate, I would offer, and this is certainly the case in corporate America, I'd say generally, if the characteristic that defines more often than not how a hire or a certain hire to be made is they're going to hire somebody they feel safe with. That doesn't always mean it's going to be white people. A Black person might be the safe choice. But I raise that just to say, we have to always be mindful that, and again, this gets into the implicit bias piece. We all bring something to the interactions we have that have happened somewhere in the recesses of our mind or human experiences that are going to predispose us to certain people. And this is science and business practices demonstrate this. And so I would just offer that, certainly we all have resumes and we all have who we are on paper, and we have the schools that we went to, and we have the articles we've written, that kind of thing, or some other way of demonstration of our work. But recognizing that there are those very nebulous, very hard to define sometimes elements of who we are that are going to work to our advantage or to our disadvantage, and that people are going to use to evaluate us when we're not in the room. And frankly, whether people want to admit it or not, I think it is a degree of being the safe choice that often determines whether or not you get the job or you don't.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that. And now, with about 25 minutes left, I have to now condense the two remaining questions. You're doing a wonderful job of bringing light and insight to our plights. But now I want to go into the Black home and the Black community with this question. And you all definitely brought up the unspoken informal networks, as well as the safe, quote unquote, candidate. And I know you brothers have heard this before, and I really look forward to hearing your response. And feel free who wants to go first on this one. And you're speaking about, the likeness of these unspoken networks and how people, Black staff or Black congressmen and women and Black professionals only hire Black staff. That's the only way the Black staff are hired. They're not hired for the most part by the white counterparts. And so what I'm hearing and framing is predominantly white organizations definitely have some implicit bias or explicit bias as it pertains to Black masculinity and their relationship to that. And so this brings up the concept of the Black, or what they call the Big Mama syndrome, where Black women, this portrait that during the Reconstruction era, this portrait is now full of women for the most part, that you see a lot more of. And the Big Mama syndrome actually speaks of the plight of now Black women being flooded in public policy and leadership positions, white collar work, all of the above, where they don't actually feel the support either. They have the positions and they have the high representation. However, that comes with the stress, the chronic stress and the pressures of being not only the matriarch of the Black family, but also the matriarch and the Black representative in all of these white collar offices. And so my question to you is, why do you think, beyond what you just spoke of as far as all of the challenges and cultural barriers, why isn't there enough Black men that come to the support and rescue of these Black women that represent the Black community in these predominantly white organizations and leadership positions?
I don't mind starting off again there. First, I want to say that I tip my hat to all Black women who are honestly leading many of these fights for us, whether it's in the financial sector and public policy, education, healthcare, moving things forward for the community as a whole. I also, want to state that like the racialization of gender is very different, right? So oftentimes we think of things as like, well, there's Black issues, and the way intersectionality works, you kind of, stack building blocks of oppression. And we all know that's not the way it works, right? Like your maleness doesn't mean, you get 5 PowerPoints, right? But then you lose 2 because you're Black. That's not the way people interact with folks. Obviously, your background and family network has an impact, your own economic situation you're coming from, your education, all the things interact. I think the difference is that, first off, a lot more Black men do need to come to the aid and support of Black women. I was very happy. I didn't say this at the beginning. I chair our House Democratic Caucus in Annapolis. We had a very contentious fight where essentially trying to choose the leadership became between a white older woman and a middle-aged Black man, and we couldn't find consensus. And I helped bridge the gap. And the speaker that we have now is Adrienne Jones, a Black woman from Baltimore County, one of the only women, let alone, only current Black woman serving as presiding officer. And that's great, right? We need to do a lot more of that. I would also say that we also have to get comfortable talking about the differences in our struggle and how we need to be there for each other uniquely. So for example, one of the things that I talk about often is that when you look at the unemployment rate for Black men and Black women, it's very comparable, but they only account for people who are actively seeking jobs, right? So then when you add in the fact that Black men are disproportionately incarcerated more than any other group in this country, our unemployment rate is actually a lot higher, right, than everybody else. And that's unique and different, right? So then why are Black men being pipelined into incarceration in different ways? Whether it's school to prison pipeline, or the way the criminal justice system work with us, or maybe issues we may have in our own family. I mean, one of the conversations as Black men we need to have often too is that, like, there are more, I wouldn't say a lot, because I imagine there's not enough, but there are more support networks for Black women to be able to talk about their struggles that they're going through, and there aren't enough for Black men. And I think that is another issue. But my point being is that I think one of the reasons why we have these unique inequities is because we haven't fully appreciated the racialization of gender or the generalization of race. I don't know, you're the professor, you let me know what's the more appropriate way. And it affects things differently, and we have to be there for each other in different ways.
Thank you, Brother Jazz. Either one of you gentlemen want to take this question?
I'll try to take a hack at it. I think, here, I'll start from here. Marriage has taught me a lot. Being married to a Black woman has taught me a lot. It's taught me that we have different perspectives on life. I lived my whole life as a Black man, and I still don't know what it's like to be a Black woman. And so I think some of the disconnect can just be from the different perspectives with which we look at issues, problems, and otherwise. It doesn't make it okay. I think, Black women need us just in the same way that we need them. I wouldn't be half the man I am in the last 5 years without my wife. So, I think it's incredibly important that we stand by a Black woman, support them both emotionally and professionally. I think looking for young talent that we can help groom just because it's a young Black woman. I think we often see ourselves in young Black men, but we should also find opportunities to raise great leaders in our young Black women and our young Black women. And then also really trying to help see through some of the difference in life perspective that, is I think, similar to what it's like to be a white farmer in, Kansas. Like, I have no idea what it's like to be a white farmer in Kansas. Their perspective, the things they think about, their worries, their concerns, is probably why they have different perspective on different issues. And I think it's not as vast a difference, but there is a difference, I think, between how sometimes Black men may look at issues and Black women may look at issues. And sometimes there may be disagreements there. But I think regardless, that emotional support, that professional support, and making sure that those voices are always heard in the room is the only way that I think we get to a better place as a city, as a state, and as a country. I'm not sure if it was Paul or Jazz that said this earlier, just making sure that we get those voices heard, that those different perspectives are heard in the room is a big part of making good policy and making good decisions as policymakers. So, I'm not sure if I've quite answered that question, but I can tell you a big part of my perspective on this has been as a husband and learning to be that, and really sort of looking at the lessons learned in my marriage and sometimes the disparities that I see between Black men and Black women, the challenges that may come up in those relationships, or sometimes Black men not quite showing up and stepping up to the table to back up our Black women. We definitely need to be there. They're there for us. They always have been. And I think we should be thinking, and not just accidentally doing so, but thinking of ways to better support our Black women in the policy sector. So.
Yeah, well, one thing I might offer, and this is definitely a provocative framing and questioning, Rico, and I don't know how much I will be able to do to answer questions specifically, but one thing I want to share is I wrote an article with a couple other colleagues of mine a few months back, and op-ed that ran in Barron's that noted some of the points that I referenced earlier in terms of the both in the U.S. Senate, but also in senior staff positions in the U.S. Senate, but also in the administration, that there really are very few Black men in top decision-making roles on the policy side. it was very important to me that I called out the importance, the history-making contributions that Vice President Kamala Harris, proud HBCU Howard grad, is doing in her role as Vice President, but also Susan Rice as Director of Domestic Policy Council, Dr. Cecilia Rouse, who's the chair of the Council on Economic Advisors, former Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, who's the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, as probably the, let's just say in the economic policy space, the 4 Black women who've are there because they are exceptional and are showing up every day in ways that affect and improve the lives of not just communities of color, but everyone in the country. And so it's important to call that out. But at the same time, you look and there are in the cabinet, as it were, just in the cabinet level, top cabinet positions, there's Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, again, history-making appointment there by President Biden, and then Michael Regan, who's the chair of the EPA, or the EPA Administrator, Environmental Protection Agency. But that's it in the cabinet. That's Black men. And, if you expand a little bit to the positions in the West Wing, certainly Cedric Richmond, senior advisor of the president and the head of public engagement, and his influence is unquestioned. Anybody who knows the White House, anybody who's seen Biden, the interaction, Cedric is incredibly influential. But but beyond those 3 Black men that I named in top decision-making roles, especially on policy, that's it. And I call this out in no way to suggest that the Black women that I've referenced are not getting it done, or they, but it's to say, look, we need more Black women, we need more Black men, because being in the room is so essential, to some of these conversations, and when you broaden out, you look at the cabinet offices, the 15 or so cabinet, there are chiefs of staff in these offices, Department of Education, Health and Human Services, Veterans Affairs, on down the line. There are 15 chiefs of staff. There are no Black men as chiefs of staff, 2 Black women. So hiring, obviously, that's a critical role, but how and where the secretary of whatever department spends their time, that typically runs through the chief of staff office, as we know. And I raise these points not to give a why. I'm not going to offer an explanation other than just to call out these numbers that we all need to be aware of. And look, I'm a supporter of Biden. Look, I'm all in. This is not I'm not taking hits on the president or questioning him. I think, if anything, what we've seen out of the president early in his term is a commitment to getting resources to the Black community through the American Rescue Plan. And obviously, Vice President Kamala Harris, the work that she's been doing related to pushing voting rights in particular, is one of the key roles that the president wanted her to take on. Unquestioned there, but I offer these facts, these observations to say that frankly, a lot of the voices around the president, there are few, if any, Black voices in those top roles in and around the president, and that's been written about. And so there is certainly a gender component here, but I mention this because, as we know, those of us who are lucky enough, to be in the room, and I say luck because it doesn't just happen. It's whatever preparation. I'm not saying it happened organically, work. But those of us who have an opportunity to be in some room, I firmly believe that we have to not just outperform, but be very intentional about how we are always at least knowing that some who look like us are not in rooms. Their interests have to be in the forefront of what we do when we raise our hand, raise our voice. Doesn't mean that everything we say in the boardroom or congressional staff or in some other capacity, C-suite or at a nonprofit board, doesn't mean every time we raise our hand or open our mouths, we need to be, talking about communities of color. But we at the same time need to be reminded that there are many people who look like us that don't have the ability to engage and advocate and represent the way those of us that do. And so we have to always be attentive to that, whether we're men or women, that when we have that opportunity, we have to be very intentional and advocate and push. And so, again, this doesn't answer your question, but I think, again, whether men, women, how, you know, we have got to, you know, show up every day, knowing that we're oftentimes doing that for those that aren't in a position to do so.
No, I think all of you gentlemen answered the question in your very own unique way, and definitely appreciate that. And with 9 minutes left, I put in the chat that anyone that has any burning questions, definitely post them. But while we're waiting on that, I definitely, you all just had another question emerge. You know, I don't know if you had the chance to see this documentary, or it wasn't a documentary, it was a CBS special about the Secretary of Homeland Security, I think it was, when he mentioned that ducks choose ducks, you know, and you all heard the expression "birds of a feather flock together." What that actually is homophily, that likeness attracts and is attracted to likeness. And so we definitely have some work to do in that way. But there is a one question I'd like to address. Are there any organizations that young Black men and students can join to meet and connect with mentors in the field of public policy like yourselves?
If someone has a better answer than I'm about to give, please give it. That's an excellent question. You know, that I know of, no. I think there are groups and associations, National Black Caucus and things like that, where there are opportunities to network with folks in the policy sector. And depending on where you are, there are groups where, you know, Black folks come together. They exist all over the place, but is there a dedicated group for Black men? No, not that I know of. You know, I think you have to be a little bit creative in how you want to connect with folks.
Yeah, I'd say there's, you know, there may be different affinity groups, whether it's fraternities or alumni associations or different sort of maybe regional or sort of sector specific, you know, by professions, organizations that have some element that might either relate to Black men or policy in particular. But, you know, that would require a little bit of homework to do that. I wouldn't right now be able to tell you sort of with any specificity where those might be. I'll say I'm a proud board member of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies organization, a think tank that's been around for about 50 years and was started to effectively help some of the earliest members of the Congressional Black Caucus, who in the early 70s, as they were coming into office, along with a number of Black mayors and Black elected officials around the country, sort of serve as a think tank to support their efforts. That I would just commend to anyone and looking to engage in the policy space on issues of importance to communities of color, that the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies would be a great place to go as a resource. jointcenter.org with a significant focus, as I've talked about, on congressional staff diversity, but also technology policy issues related to workforce participation, things that certainly matter to the Black community.
I would, I think both of those answers were great. And I would add that I don't know of any formal, all-encompassing, you know, like Paul and Mark stated, but there are some informal networks that just kind of have happened organically. Like there are groups of other Black men in public policy that I get with to talk, right? So sometimes we talk policy, sometimes we just, you know, we'll go to a Nats game together, right? And like the policy is like a back drop for us really just building relationships with other Black men, right? And what I would encourage is, particularly because our proximity at University of Maryland is, to intern on the Hill if you have the ability and time. One thing I just want to let folks know, they changed the policy on the Hill, so internships are paid now, which was a barrier years ago for many folks who, if you couldn't, but that's a great way to start. And as you build relationships with, let's say, the staff there, just ask them, and they may plug you into some of their informal networks. That's how I got into some of the ones I know of. Help out on or volunteer on a campaign, whether at the local, state or federal level. And as you build relationships there, you get plugged into more informal networks, in addition to those more formalized ones through affinity groups, alumni groups, fraternity sororities, and other things. Like another one that people would never really necessarily always think about is like NSBE, right? National Society of Black Engineers. But like all of these other type of groups have a policy component to them also. It's just based on your interests. Maybe you're really focused on trees. You should call Mark, or you're interested in finance. You should talk to Paul. It all depends on your interests as well.
I want to throw a little bit a piece of advice that I took very early on in my career, and I think it's been helpful in sort of crafting the opportunities that I had along the way. One of the things, and I'm always open to this if folks are interested, if you want to reach out to me, please do. I'm always an open book and happy to talk with students or folks that want to, that need some advice or some perspective. I always try to do informational interviews. People that I looked up to or was impressed by the path that they'd taken, I'd shoot them an email and ask to take them out to coffee and just ask them about how they got to where they are and recommendations that they had for me as a student at Maryland. And you'd be surprised like how windy sometimes people's paths are. It's often not straightforward and easy, but I think a couple of things often came from those interviews. One, internships, because once they learn that you're interested in their path, if they know of any opportunities, that person that you're interviewing can then potentially become a mentor or a sort of champion for you if they really do find some promise in you. So it can build into something like that. But I think having a sit down over coffee or lunch is always a great opportunity to learn from people that are doing exactly the work that you may see yourself doing in the future, or that you just want to learn how they got to where they are. It's probably not exactly the way you thought they did.
I'll add one thing to what Mark said, and it ties what Paul said earlier. When you ask for that informational interview, like come prepared, to like keep it to 15 or 30 minutes tight of their time, have clear deliverables of like information you're trying to gather, and because it will make them more willing and likely like, oh, they are prepared. This person, to Paul's point earlier, isn't a risk, right? So I can feel comfortable putting my name on you if I connect you to other people. So don't, the open-ended ones can be fine, but just, be respectful of their time.
Yeah, good point.
Wonderful, wonderful. And to Paul's point about his op-ed, I just shared in the chat of some references that also has the link to Paul's op-ed and a few more readings for those that want to take a deeper dive into this topic. With 1 minute left, I definitely want to thank you, gentlemen. I wish we had more time, and hopefully we possibly can create a series out of this where we can bring you all back and actually answer the call to something more specific and create a hub for Black men in public policy. We may have started something here, and definitely look forward to reaching out to you all informally to get to know you brothers a little better. But do you have any closing remarks or anything else to add that you wanted to get out before we let everyone go?
Look, I'll take 10 seconds and quickly say, it's tough. It's really tough. You'll find your way. I think it's important that you leverage networks and create new networks. Always find opportunities to meet people in the places that you want to be in, build relationships, get to know them, understand their path, maybe emulate their path where you think possible and necessary. And folks, I found this overwhelmingly, folks are willing to help. Sometimes people are too busy, and you can understand that, but people want to help you. Like I want to see more people take my path and surpass my path, and I'm more than happy to help folks figure out how to do that.
Thank you, Brother Mark.
I would just say, look, for anyone who's here today or going to be watching this, that's taking a good first step, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to engage with you all, Mark and Jazz, Rico, but those who are watching, making yourself available to hearing the points we've offered. Take them, discount them, what have you, but I think being intentional about navigating, finding your path, navigating that, and recognizing that it's both the hard and the soft skills that are important. And look, it's just, if this hasn't already come across, those of us, our Black and brown sisters, you got to be better. I mean, better than our counterparts. That's just built in. We don't need to unpack that anything more, but that's I think something we all bring, and that's okay. That's sort of a reality, and find ways to make that work for you and rise to that occasion, and not shrink from it. But thank you for letting us be with you, and really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you too, Brother Paul. And Jazz, you close us out.
Sure. I just want to leave you all with to be kind to yourselves as you figure out your journey. It may not be very predictable or easy at moments. And I promise you, we don't have enough time here, but I'm sure Paul and Mark had their own stony roads to try, right? So just be kind to yourself. It's life isn't a crystal stair. As you're figuring these things out, I think I 100% agree with Mark and Paul, and being prepared. You have to work twice as hard, but do the necessary work to be kind to yourself and take care of your own mental health. There's a lot going on in this world, and I appreciate you for tuning in.
Thank you, Brother Jazz. Thank you, gentlemen, again, and thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we can do this again. I enjoyed myself, and I'm definitely honored. So you all enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend, and enjoy this fall season, my favorite. All right, you all take care, and see you all soon, hopefully.